Welcome back. You had a short break. I hope you're ready and strong now to tackle work further. Remember that we're exploring revision work and we're at the moment looking at how to answer data response questions. So we're here, data response questions. Let's try another one. Answer the questions based on the following graphs. Now, before you even get to the questions, please look at the graphs. Both of them show size of population on the y-axis and time, but the actual graph, the curve, is different. What kind of population growth is shown in graph A? What is this called? I hope you're able to shout it out for me. Exponential. Explain this kind of growth. We're going to talk about the lack of limiting factors, which means that the population is growing in ideal conditions and therefore it just continues to grow and grow and grow. There's no deceleration of population growth. Let's move on. Question number 3. Which graph shows the most likely growth curve of a squirrel population in a game reserve? So we're not looking at the ideal conditions that are shown in graph A. We're looking at a natural population where the squirrel will be subjected to limiting factors, disease, predators. And so we've got growth in the population, but then the population rate will stabilize and we will see the typical logistic growth curve of a population growing in a very stable environment with limiting factors and a carrying capacity, bringing about environmental resistance. Moving on, which graph shows a population in ideal conditions? And we must also provide reasons. Our ideal population growth curve is graph A. And why have I selected that? Because there's no evidence of limiting factors. Enough food, enough space, everything is perfect for the population, so it just continues to grow without any environmental resistance. Why don't populations grow indefinitely? Refer to the graphs in your explanation. Why don't they continue just to grow and grow and grow like in graph A? Well, we've come back to these concepts of limiting factors, environmental resistance, and these ideas create the carrying capacity of the environment, which limits how dense that population can become. I hope you found those questions fairly simple. So let's try another question. This is a little more tricky. Study the resources, and we've got a text resource, and the resource says, in 1911, 75 reindeer were introduced onto St. Paul Island near Alaska. There were no predators of the reindeer on the island. That's important. Are we going to be able to have emigration or immigration on an island? No hunting was permitted. See what I've done to the text? I've highlighted things that are possibly going to be important to consider as I answer the questions. And there's a picture to help me because we don't get reindeer in South Africa, so it might not be something that you are familiar with. So there's a picture to help me understand what a reindeer is. The second resource is the graph. And where does this graph come from? Scientists kept careful track of numbers of reindeer on St. Paul's. And we remember it started at 1911 and we see that the graph ends at 1950. 1950. This is a very famous and classical example of a population and how its growth curve went. And it's a real situation. And so we call that a case study. What was the size of the population of reindeer at the beginning of the study? Now, what you can do is you can go back to read the text, or you can look on the graph, and the graph shows us and the text very clearly that there were 75 reindeer at the beginning of the study. Next question. What was the size of the population in 1920, in 1930, in 1940, and in 1950? All right, so we will draw our vertical lines, we will read across, and this is essential that you use a ruler so that you can get the exact figures, and you're going to read off those figures against the y-axis. During which years was the increase in the population the greatest? So we need to go, where was the slope the steepest? And we come to these years. Between the years of 1930 and 1940, we've got the steepest growth rate, and that means that that was when the population increased the most. Explain why the population growth curve of the reindeer looked the way it did from 1911 all the way up to 1940. What we are doing then is we're explaining the very typical exponential curve. So we're saying that they were introduced to the island. There must have been lots of food available on the island. We see that it was the correct or ideal conditions for this group of reindeer. There were no predators, nothing to stop their growth. Even humans were not allowed to hunt them to keep their numbers down. And so we see that the population doubled every year. There was this increase, and it was an exponential increase in the number of reindeer. What is this kind of growth curve called? Well, we've explained it. That kind of growth curve is the J-shaped curve that is typical of exponential growth rate. Number 9, could immigration or emigration have played a role in determining the size of this population? And explain your reasoning. Well, remember, in the beginning, you were told that St. Paul's is an island, and there's sea all around. And then there is the mainland of Alaska. And we know, therefore, that we could not have emigration or immigration because the reindeer cannot swim over the sea. So we know that no, immigration and emigration couldn't have played a role, and our reasoning is associated with the idea that St. Paul's is an island. What might account for the tremendous increase in the population of the reindeer in the 1930s as compared to the growth rate from 1911 to 1920. So here we see there is an increase in the growth rate, but wow, once we hit the 1930s, that growth rate is incredibly steep. So here we've got a small number of reindeer to begin with. But once we hit the 1930s, we've doubled that population. Let's say half of the population was female. That means that 200 females can produce offspring, and there we're going to get a doubling of the population rate every single year. So from 200 females to 400 to 800, we're going to see that there is an exponential doubling of the population over time. What might have happened on the island to cause this tremendous change in population from 1940 to 1950? We are not given this information. So that means you have to predict. What you're doing now is you are using your knowledge to talk about things like the carrying capacity of the land. We're talking about limiting factors causing environmental resistance, and the land could no longer support this incredibly large population of reindeer, and in fact, the population crashed. The land could no longer cope with those high levels of reindeer living on a very definite portion of land where they couldn't emigrate or find food in other areas. What does this study tell you about the carrying capacity of this island for reindeer? Well, the graph would never have decreased like this if we had have met the carrying capacity slightly earlier. So we would have to say that on this island, the carrying capacity has been exceeded. In 1950, there were only 8 reindeer left on St. Paul's. It's now 2021, and we've got 400 reindeer on the island. And this number, so we've now gone up to 400, and it's remained constant. Explain this phenomenon. And this phenomenon means that the carrying capacity of the reindeer on the island is in fact around 500, not 1,900 that it originally skipped to. What difference might hunters or predators have had on the population? Well, if we had predators, we would have seen that we would have got towards our carrying capacity. We wouldn't have exceeded the carrying capacity at all. And so we come to the end of our revision session on these aspects of population control and population growth curves. And we've seen how we can go through different kinds of questions that might appear in your tests or exams. In our next lesson, we're going to focus on human populations and interactions in populations, and hopefully you will use the skills that we've learned in this lesson to be able to answer all the different kinds of questions again in our next lesson. But for today, from me, Mama H, bye-bye.